It is a deep pleasure to be able to introduce to you our next speaker, John Buchanan, who's going to continue in this rich vein that we're slightly embarrassed by and titillated, and I'm wondering about the etymological connection between embarrassment and embrasser, to embrace, to kiss in French. I've got to look that up. So there's some real embrace here of mysteries that are in part pseudo-mysteries, but because beneath them are some deeper mysteries that are journeys into precisely what William James called the more. And I have to say that it was years and years ago that I first met John Buchanan and heard him speaking so eloquently, so elegantly out of his research on William James. And it was because of John Buchanan's brilliance on James that I started occasionally making little forays into that Jamesian more, and even discovered Gustav Fechner through James, through your work, and the soul life or the psychic life of plants, and another one of these strange 19th century geniuses. James kept thinking it would be a Fechnerian century, but it was really John Buchanan who channeled my attention towards that Jamesian capital letter M more, and he has continued to work in amazing ways as a leader, and of course as the mysterious angel, by the way, of this conference. And we need to say thank you to John and to his family's foundation for the kind of support that makes this conference and so many other events possible. But his intellectual leadership, his concrete leadership, also converged at another point many years ago, about 15, I think, when he organized a powwow between Whiteheadians and paranormal thinkers on transpersonal psychology in Whitehead up at Esalen. And, this was an extraordinary event to see John Cobb and David Griffin being, led into holotropic breathing by Stanislav Grof, with whom John Buchanan has worked quite closely. So there we were going into, relatively deep states, or not. There were rationalists among us, but we were on quite an adventure there at Esalen, the very site that I have come since to respect in many new ways and to visit over and over again, all because of John Buchanan. And of course now the old connection of Esalen to the support of those very physicists that Kaiser talks about is legendary, right? In this MIT physicist book, there are lots of photographs of Esalen and of the meetings that it supported of these physicists who at that time were doing very marginalized work, which can no longer be marginalized. And John has just been in on that trajectory in important and subtle ways, often behind the scenes, leading our thought on transpersonal psychology and paranormal thinking. Though, speaking of embarrassment, I mean, the problem was at that conference that one would go to the hot tubs where one was required to be naked, and one might bump into John Cobb or David Griffin there in one of those Esalen hot tubs. This was not supernatural, but it was a very paranormal naturalism. But for all of these many enchanting dimensions, we have John Buchanan to thank.
Thank you for recalling those grand days at Esalen. David had his work cut out for him, getting people to actually come to the meetings. Usually at Esalen, you spend the afternoon getting massages and going to the hot tubs, and some of the transpersonal psychologists were a little shocked to find that we might be working during the day also. So we did manage to have a massage for everyone, though. Let's see, what I was remembering when we were talking about near-death experiences. I cut it out of my paper, but there was a wonderful little exchange in David's book between a doctor had written into the Journal for the American Medical Association in response to reports on near-death experiences, saying that he thought it was wrong to be presenting religious beliefs as scientific data. So this Dr. Sabum, who's done some wonderful research at Emory on near-death experiences, wrote back saying that he thought it was also a mistake to confuse scientific beliefs with scientific data. And the debate went on a little bit more, where he said, the other doctor said, I don't think I have to apologize for not believing in spooks in the operating room, and so these things go back and forth. But yeah, near-death experiences present very interesting data, but also quite difficult to really get hold of, as all evidence for life after death is rather difficult to feel as if you have something concrete. I had, after the lectures last night, I was a little nervous about the competition I had just seen for the wonderful lectures. So I was joking with Philip Clayton that I was going to give my lecture telepathically and then require psychokinetically get my applause. But I realized that was probably what Marcus Ford should be doing, whereas I would probably have to do something more dramatic, such as die. And somehow, but then I realized I couldn't get the evidence back to you anyway, so I was kind of stuck there. I don't think probably that life after death is the linchpin of David Griffin's work, so I may be the only lecturer that it's not. But it is, I would say, a linchpin for most of for each of us. It's a topic of vital importance for our futures. Oddly enough, I would say in my area of transpersonal psychology that parapsychology, which I would say is a branch of that, is probably the most respectable part of transpersonal psychology, which has the strongest scientific evidence for it. So I've been working on the margins all my life, and Catherine has been exaggerating my efforts. I'm still trying to rewrite my dissertation after 15 years. At Esalen, David mentioned that he was thinking of writing a book on transpersonal psychology and its philosophical foundations, and since I just finished my dissertation on that and was thinking about rewriting it into a book, I nearly fell off. I would have fallen off my chair, except we were all sitting on the floor. David kindly backed off on that and has gone on to write about 30 books, and I'm still working on my rewrite. But I am working on it, David. So, I have read Marcus's excellent book on James, which was probably where I got most of my material for the talk I gave on him, and as well as James's pluralistic universe. I remember being in Australia, and I was worried I was going to be redundant. I had something like a process pluralistic universe for my topic, and I said, how many people are familiar with James? And I don't think anybody raised their hands in the audience. And so I was shocked and glad that at least I had something to talk about. I would say, though, following Marcus Ford, I'm not sure if I have anything to talk about. So you covered the material extraordinarily well. So I will focus on the parapsychological evidence for life after death, of course. David says that the way often how people react to the topic of life after death is to say, well, it's impossible, and there's no evidence for it, and it wouldn't be a good thing anyway. And I found, writing this paper, I was talking to various people, and I found that was pretty much what people would think, and that people were very, I thought seemed rather uptight when I would bring up the topic. They seemed so they didn't really want to hear about it, and they seemed rather defensive of their positions. And I was thinking about why that might be the case, and I think it has to do with hope. You know, for the people that have given up hope, it's like you don't want to have the possibility stirred up that maybe there's a chance, but I'd already given up on the chance, you know. But for people who believe in it, you know, they don't want to hear something that might threaten their belief in it. So it's a very I think, emotional topic for people. And David talks about emotion being one of the reasons why it's difficult, why life after death is so controversial, as well as the lack of general awareness of the interesting evidence supporting it, and of course the worldview, which has been discussed here, of whether or not it's possible within the worldview. So it's basically, David presents two questions in his wonderful book, which is the ontological question, which is it possible for the mind or soul to exist apart from the body? Because, you know, if that's not a possibility, then we really don't need to go any further looking at the evidence. And then there's the epistemological question, you know, what is the evidence for this possibility? I was reminded that when I was before I went off to undergraduate school, I'd taken a year off and was doing various traveling, and I came back and had gotten involved in psychedelics, which had sort of opened up my rather rigid viewpoint on these topics. And I thought, well, I'm going to take a class in philosophy in the summer school and then head off to college. And there was a class on the introduction to philosophy. And so, you know, I was finding it somewhat interesting, although I was rather distracted. But towards the end of the class, the professor wanted to present his own perspective on philosophy, which was that, it seems odd, but as I recall, it was that the only questions that philosophy should consider are the ones that can be proven by true or false by science. Now, in the first place, I thought, well, it seems like the most interesting questions for philosophy would be the ones that science couldn't prove. You know, I mean, that seems like the real realm. But more specifically, I thought, well, how would you know exactly which questions could or could not be answered by philosophy? So I asked him that. And coincidentally, the answer he gave was, well, we could never prove whether or not there's life after death. And I said, well, you know, what if someone invented kind of a radio-like device, you know, kind of electronic medium, and everybody started chatting with their dead relatives, and, you know, Plato was giving lectures, and you know, everyone, you know, this became part of our normal, you know, our life, you know, and everyone, I would think, you know, that would become part of the worldview, and, you know, science would acknowledge that was what happened. And he said, well, that's impossible. And I said, well, that's my point. How do you know that's impossible? And so we argued about it a little bit, and he gave me a B for the course instead of an A. And so I'm very grateful that David has given me this topic so I can redress that injustice in this forum today. I've known David for a long time, and as you all know, he's perhaps, I shouldn't even probably have the word perhaps in here, but perhaps the most rigorous researcher, not to mention thinker, that I know. When he undertakes an investigation of a subject, it will be careful and thorough. All of this was evident when I read through his papers on life after death, and in particular his major work on this topic, Parapsychology, Philosophy, and Spirituality. Ironically, I had not read this book yet. I'm embarrassed to say, David. It's you know, it's the book that most directly bears on my interest in transpersonal psychology. So I was very glad that I did this, because I also did some background reading, and I had neglected this area quite badly. I went into this project without any strong opinions, one way or the other, about the possibility of life after death. Despite my readings and experiences in transpersonal psychology, nothing had really struck me as persuasive either way. I took a class when I was at Claremont. I studied for a year at Claremont and took a couple courses with David, one in William James's psychical research. I assume David was researching parapsychology at the time, but I also took one with John Hick, who has this monumental book, Death and Eternal Life, where he investigates the question of life after death. And it was interesting and impressive, but what it seemed like there was some moderately suggestive evidence for parapsychology in his book, and a lot of thoughtful philosophical speculation, but with really very, very little metaphysical grounding that I thought to make sense of his overall view. So it was a revelation to discover Griffin's exacting study of the evidence for survival hypothesis. His unwavering commitment to fairly examine alternative explanations for this evidence, and his overarching philosophical contextualization of the issue in all of its historical, scientific, and metaphysical dimensions. A little summary of the book: his writings on the survival hypothesis cogently address our culture's emotional and intellectual obstacles to accepting the possibility of life after death, or conversely, uncritically assuming its existence, and thus being able to openly and fairly assess the relevant empirical evidence, which is considerable and impressive. Through a revealing historical study, which we've heard about today, he pinpoints the bases for the biases found in our contemporary intellectual climb that lead it to deny outright the very possibility of life after death. Griffin suggests an alternative philosophical vision that not only opens the door to the possibility of survival, but also addresses other related major problems with the modern thought in such areas as mind-body relations, the nature of consciousness, grounding of moral and aesthetic intuitions, and a realistic conception of causality and temporal order. Thus, the same ideas that open the modern worldview to the possibility of parapsychological phenomena, including evidence for survival of death, also provide a philosophical perspective that is much more coherent with the foundations of everyday life, as well as the findings of modern science. Finally, Griffin suggests, rightly I believe, that the evidence for life after death strengthens the notion of our life and our world and the universe as a spiritual adventure, a perspective that can prove difficult to entertain or maintain with the underlying belief that this life is all I've got. I don't know how much detail I have to go into in his historical analysis of the antecedents of our modern worldview that lead us to question life after death so severely. But until recent, I had a section on John Hick's study of the history of life after death. But life after death has been a belief in in all times in the past, in nearly every culture or society that's been studied. So it's been an extremely commonly held view, and is still, obviously widely held in many parts of the globe. So we have to look at why have things changed so radically in the modern world. And David, of course, locates it in the formation of the early modern worldview, where Descartes' philosophy was adopted, and largely, as David has just talked about, for religious reasons, to preserve a place in the world for God and for the confirmation of Christianity's being the one true religion. By delineating a realm of the soul not subject to the mechanistic causal laws of the new physics, the immortality of the human soul, the possibility of miracles, and the existence of God could be preserved. And David in particular emphasizes that that action at a distance was intentionally ruled out by this mechanistic philosophy to protect this realm of God in the church. By the 19th century, the revolution in thought springing out of the theories of Freud and Darwin, along with other scientific and philosophical advancements, led to the collapse of Cartesian dualism into a monistic, mechanistic materialism and an inevitable trend towards atheism. This late modern worldview had no place for the soul or mind except as epiphenomenon. The survival of death became an irrational impossibility. Similarly impossible were all parapsychological phenomena that relied on action at a distance, which is ruled out even more thoroughly by late modernism, as there's no way for an epiphenomenon to exert any kind of influence. So here's the root of the problem of getting a fair hearing for parapsychological evidence, including evidence bearing on life after death, since action at a distance is impossible in both versions of modernism, and survival of death in the later version. In sum, modern thought and sensibility discourage belief in life after death on the basis of three mutually reinforcing claims that I mentioned at the beginning. Life after death is impossible. There's no evidence for it, and it's a bad thing to believe in anyway. I'll let David talk about why it's a bad thing to believe in afterwards. I mentioned why it's a good thing at the end of this paper. Having recently discussed the possibility of life after death with a number of people, I can see the wisdom of Griffin's point that before one can effectively present the case for the evidence of survival, it's first necessary to show that the existence of mind apart from the body is even conceivable. That's the ontological issue that needs to be resolved. As we've seen, both monistic materialism and dualism prove inadequate to this task. Materialism offers no possibility of survival whatsoever, while dualism provides no coherent way of conceiving of mind-body interaction even in life, and thus is in no position to offer a plausible theory of life after death. Fortunately, there's the pan-experientialistic option, which has a non-dualistic interactionism, which I've been trying to explain to my father-in-law, who actually taught Whitehead and is a professional philosopher, but he doesn't seem to get it. I remember John Cobb saying one time that he thought even a professional philosopher should not attempt to read Process and Reality on their own, unguided. And when I get back, I'm going to make another stab at this. It's surprising. I remember I had difficulty grasping this notion that there actually was another occasion that was going on somewhere in the interstices of the brain interacting with the neural events. And getting my mind around it. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, this is really a different and novel way of approaching it. But it's very difficult to communicate because it's such a really radical break in the tradition. But once there, it just opens up the door to so many new possibilities. So there's a non-dualistic interactionism where I won't go on, you're Whiteheadians, but Griffin thereby is proposing a non-dualistic, neo-animistic, pan-experientialistic philosophy in which experience and spontaneity are fully natural features of the world, characteristic of nature at every level. So in such a universe, parapsychological phenomena are a real possibility. Materialism deems life after death impossible since the mind is at best epiphenomenal, is completely dependent on the brain-body for its existence. Thus, survival becomes an absurdity. H.H. Price clarifies this point nicely, I think. He says that if one equates life with certain very complicated physiochemical processes, then of course life after death is by definition impossible. But if the human psyche consists of a flow of occasions of experience and interaction with the brain-body and the universe at large, it is no longer absurd to speculate about this flow of psychic experience continuing after the death of its bodily matrix. So he thinks that life after death could be thought of instead as the problem of after-death experience. So let's look at the parapsychological evidence for survival. As David mentioned, he focused on 5 different types of evidence supportive of, that bears on the notion of life after death. I believe David said he was originally going to have that be one chapter of his book, but he ended up having a chapter for each of these phenomena. So I can guarantee you he looked at the evidence and the philosophical dimensions of it very, very closely. It will quickly become evident to the neutral observer that the surprisingly strong evidence for survival requires some type of paranormal explanation, unless one clings to the idea that since these phenomena are inherently impossible, fraud and gullibility and misinterpretation must account for all this evidence. And from my reading, a lot of people cling to this particular point of view. No, I mean, it's quite amazing. Admittedly, phenomena suggestive of survival can be difficult to interpret, not to mention almost impossible to study under controlled conditions. But we do not need repeatable, irrefutable proof of life after death to take seriously what evidence is available. As William James famously pointed out, and Griffin takes to heart, it takes only one white crow to prove not all crows are black. Regarding the scientific standard of repeatability, Griffin argues that there are 4 ways that the evidence from parapsychology can be claimed to be repeatable. Griffin's 4 kinds of white crows are 1, trustworthy intellectuals who have carefully investigated psychic phenomena and become convinced of its significance. 2, individuals who have clearly demonstrated that they possess parapsychological powers. 3, the ubiquity of parapsychological phenomena across cultures and throughout history. And 4, the incontrovertible experimental confirmations from parapsychological research. All of these white crows exist. The difficult task is to find evidence for survival that cannot just as easily be understood in terms of what David calls retroprehensive inclusion, super psi, or other forms of ESP that are possible within a pan-experientialistic universe. In Whiteheadian metaphysics, the entire past is available to each new occasion of experience. This opens the door all the way for theories of super psi, where ESP of unlimited powers can be used to account for almost any paranormal phenomena. Retroprehension refers to a direct prehension of occasions of experience belonging to the life of another person, and could be used to account for how mediums gain knowledge from the deceased and the living, along with other parapsychological phenomena. Going a step further, it might be possible for these experiences from other human psyches to get synthesized within a receptive human mind in a mode that includes their original sense of self-identity, and the other's experiences would feel like one's own. Griffin terms this retroprehensive inclusion and points out that it could contribute to or even account for the evidence from cases of possession and reincarnation. So you can imagine that instead of being reincarnated, you're really just feeling somebody's past life so completely and intimately that it seems like it was your own, so it's becomes somewhat tricky to sort out, is it really reincarnation, or is it just you're feeling this, you're not really that person, it just feels like you're that person. Sorting out explanations involving retroprehensive inclusion from those based on the survival hypothesis is one of the major challenges for parapsychological theory, or perhaps I should say for parapsychological meta-theory. Griffin considers 5 types of parapsychological evidence that bear on the possibility of life after death: mediumistic messages, possession cases, cases of reincarnation, apparitions, and out-of-body and near-death experiences, which he groups together. Unfortunately, it's not possible in this forum to do justice to Griffin's careful analysis of each of these phenomena. Instead, I'll use his treatment of reincarnation as an example of his scrupulous investigative technique, while providing a very cursory summary of his conclusions regarding the other 4 kinds of evidence. After reviewing the broad-ranging evidence from studies of mediums, especially in the late 19th and 20th century, Griffin concludes, even the most impressive evidence from mediumistic messages would not, by itself, constitute sufficiently strong evidence for life after death. If that were all we had to go on, we should probably conclude that, as complex as the super psi hypothesis must become to account for all the evidence, it is to be preferred to the survivalist hypothesis. In regard to possession cases, the evidence on its own is insufficient to establish life after death, as other parapsychological explanations such as telepathy and retroprehensive inclusion offer equally viable alternatives. Both phenomena, however, do provide definite evidence of paranormal knowledge and are suggestive of post-mortem agency, that is, influence from the dead. And when you read David provides some very interesting case studies in all of these areas, and when you read these, the case studies themselves are really quite astonishing. It's not like we have to sort of wonder whether there's some paranormal activity going on here. These people have knowledge that there's no way that could be explained within a materialistic viewpoint. The upshot of Griffin's analysis of the evidence of apparitions is that non-survivalist theories seem so overly complex and problematic that one is inclined to turn to explanations that rely on some type of post-mortem agency, which is important, by the way, in trying to sort out whether there's whether there's really activity from the no longer living, or this is just living people somehow accessing past information. In sum, the evidence suggests that the apparitions of the dead reflect the autonomy of still conscious minds. Thus, apparitions offer surprisingly strong evidence for the reality of survival. Apparitions, by the way, are ghosts. However, this evidence is strengthened even more by the phenomena of out-of-body experiences, which support the idea that living persons are able to have experiences outside their bodies. They also represent a phenomena that parallels perceptions of apparitions of the living. In other words, I'm seeing something out there and people are having experiences of being outside their bodies out there. Especially suggestive are those special experiences where the apparition or the person having an out-of-body experience and observer are mutually aware of one another, referred to as reciprocal cases. These cases lend credence to the idea that a real agent is actually present in some way when the apparition is observed. Turning to the cases of reincarnation, in-depth investigation by Ian Stevenson in particular has established that the extraordinary knowledge demonstrated by many people claiming to be reincarnated regarding their previous lives, along with the exhibition of talents and abilities highly incongruent with their current life experience, demands some kind of parapsychological explanation. The available options appear to be either literal reincarnation, where the experiential center of a human psychic order surviving death and incarnating into a new body, or a paranormal theory that bestows some individuals with almost unlimited access to the experiences of others' past lives. Griffin's methodological consideration of objections to the survival hypothesis in terms of super psi and retroprehensive inclusion alternatives is worthy of Sherlock Holmes. Griffin argues that a strong form of super psi could account for skills supposedly inherited through reincarnation, and that retroprehensive inclusion could explain why only one past personality is accessed in reincarnation cases, as well as why these experiences are felt as memories. By one past personality means why people they're reincarnated, don't feel like they're being reincarnating two people at the same time. Requiring more careful analysis are intriguing phenomena announcing dreams, where someone has a premonition that a dead person will be reincarnating soon, usually as a new family or tribal member, and congenital deformities that correspond to physical characteristics of the individual supposedly being reincarnated. If someone will be born and have say that they were shot in a past life and killed, and they'll have a mark in the chest and in the back where a bullet apparently went through the person that killed the person. So they have physical characteristics corresponding to the person that they had reincarnated. Paranormal birthmarks and deformities could be explained in Griffin suggests that announcing dreams can be adequately understood through the powers of super psi combined with the creativity of dreams. I'm not doing justice to his several-page analysis of this, but paranormal birthmarks and deformities could be explained in terms of maternal psychokinesis and telepathy, where the mother's largely unconscious paranormal activities selecting and guiding the process of memory appropriation and physical mimicry of her fetus, for her fetus. It's important to note that maternal impressions, the mother's unconscious ability to create birthmarks, was at one time widely accepted in the medical community. Cases of intermission memories, memories of existence between incarnations, while difficult to verify and not abundant, are suggestive of literal reincarnation, although they can also be explained in terms of super psi telepathy. The impressive evidence for out-of-body experience offers more support for literal reincarnation, as super psi theories would predict that any kind of disincarnate existence is impossible. At the end of his carefully reasoned analysis of the evidence relating to reincarnation, Griffin points out two phenomena that present particularly strong reasons for thinking that a literal approach to theories of reincarnation should be adopted over some kind of retroprehensive or super psi strategy. Literal reincarnation is supported both by the fact that the same person does not reincarnate into more than one body, and that only dead people reincarnate. Retroprehensive inclusion would make multiple reincarnations of the same person into different bodies a real possibility, which does not in fact seem ever to occur, and would also suggest that psyches of the living should at times be subject to reincarnation. In other words, if what you're doing is taking on a person's memories and subjectivity from the past, why not reincarnate as Tom Cruise? Why wouldn't I be Tom Cruise? That really, although people sometimes sort of claim that, these are not cases that seem to bear out as real examples of reincarnation. Griffin's review of the evidence. The tension between, and I know you're all on pins and needles to find out if we're going to have life after death here, so if you wait just another moment. This tension between the survival hypothesis and the super-psi hypothesis contains an important implication. If one looks fairly at the evidence for life after death, one is confronted with this dilemma, either admitting the reality of survival or having to resort to a super-psi theory to explain the paranormal evidence. Either way, the door to parapsychology has been opened wide. Regarding the significance of the 5 kinds of evidence for life after death, Griffin states, 4 of them contain phenomena that were in themselves strongly suggestive of survival, the exception being possession cases. He goes on to argue that this evidence is much stronger when taken as a whole. It is mutually reinforcing for 3 reasons. The first is the principle of parsimony. Only one theory, survival, is called upon to explain many kinds of evidence and phenomena. Second, each kind of evidence strengthens the likelihood of the others. There are many kinds of evidence bearing on the same question, all of which demand explanation. Third, some of the phenomena provide support for elements of the others. More particularly, out-of-body experiences provide good evidence that the mind can exist apart from the body. Apparitions and mediumistic communications offer real evidence of postmortem agency. Reincarnation cases are suggestive of a literal survival and continuing existence for the soul. And all 5 kinds of evidence of phenomena demand some kind of paranormal explanation. Based on the metaphysical possibilities offered by panexperientialism and the existence of ESP and psychokinesis, Griffin puts the odds of survival at 50% insofar as assigning a numerical figure makes any sense at all. Once the evidence supporting life after death is factored in, which, as we have just seen, is quite striking, the odds must be even higher in favor of the survival hypothesis. What is Griffin's final conclusion, you may ask? As we've seen, Griffin does believe that survival is metaphysically possible and the evidence is strong, but perhaps there's a better way to frame this issue. Griffin writes, one cannot prove either the truth or the falsity of the belief in life after death. The question should be posed instead in terms of the most plausible theory, Plato's most likely account. In terms of this question, I've suggested that there is formidable evidence for life after death, some of which can be given a super-psi explanation at best with considerable difficulty, and can be more naturally and simply explained in terms of a survivalist hypothesis. The final chapter of parapsychology, philosophy, and spirituality focuses on the importance of being able to experience life as a spiritual journey. Griffin makes a convincing and rather surprising for a theologian case that the powers and possibilities for the soul that are found in parapsychology provide the necessary ingredients, when combined with the pan-experientialist philosophy, for the kind of robust, naturalistic religion that is needed to face our world's unprecedented challenges. These ingredients include a self-determining freedom, a psyche that can directly influence its world for better or worse, the possibility of experiencing guiding values that arise from a universal center of power, not understood as an omnipotent God, but rather as a holy reality that is perfect in goodness as well as supreme in power, and authentic mystical experiences of God in all their manifold dimensions. In other words, a religion empowered by spiritual adventure, an enchanted universe, a psychic soul, and a real loving God. The final possibility offered by parapsychology is life after death. Experiences after death are vital to Griffin's notion of a spiritual journey, for, he writes, unless we can believe that lives lived as spiritual journeys will have time to reach their destination, we probably cannot believe that the universe in any sense intends them to be spiritual journeys. Some of the benefits that could accrue from envisioning our lives as extended spiritual journeys include relieving modernity's excessive fear of death, instilling courage for social action in the face of powerful resistance. If I get killed when I'm occupying Wall Street, I've come back and work at that again, reducing materialism and reorienting society towards the creative pursuit of spiritual goals. To face the challenges the future holds, our civilization will need all of these spiritual assets. Having carefully studied Griffin's ideas and the possibility of life after death, I'm surprised to discover that I too find survival to be the most plausible hypothesis. Despite my deep and long-standing interest in these topics, if asked about life after death 6 months ago, I would have felt agnostic and probably repeated the famous saying about why not to believe in an afterlife. I would rather be pleasantly surprised than bitterly disappointed. Now I would rather lead my life believing what is more probably true, and my journey feels enriched because of it. Thanks. My father-in-law did annoyingly ask me one question, which still has me pondering. He said, since all actual occasions are spatio-temporal events, where do these events, these afterlife experiential events occur? Now, in reincarnation, that's pretty easy. In apparitions, you can sort of see, well, there's the ghost over there. But I thought, well, where do they occur? Where do the other ones go? I don't think everyone goes to the moon and hangs out there. So I started asking John Cobb about it and David, and they mentioned extra dimensions. But if anyone has any snappy answers for me to give my father-in-law on where we might be after death, I would appreciate any input. First from David.
Well, thank you, John. One thing I did not know when this topic was assigned to you is that at that point, you yourself didn't really believe in life after death. I just assumed because of all the work you had done, you did. So I was very interested to find that the exercise had that kind of influence on you. On the experience at Ethelen that John had organized, and we were doing holotropic breathing. And since then, I've never done that again. Because after going through it, I was sitting in kind of a daze, and here came across the room this woman I know very well, this woman right here, and I could not think of her name. So, Catherine, I never want to forget your name, so that is why I will never do holotropic breathing again. John raised the question of why do some people believe this evidence for life after death is a bad thing? It seems like there are two things. One is the kind of Marxist opiate of the people argument that this evidence for life after death is going to distract people from their real battles in this world. To me, it just seems the opposite, that it tends to empower people. Now, certainly there are certain people who get only interested in that, but it seems to be much more the other way. The other group of people who reject this are the very conservative Christians, and for the same reason that they were rejecting this in the 16th and 17th and 18th century. That is, that we have proof, we Christians have proof of life after death, that is Jesus. Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And if you start saying, well, what you really have there from Jesus are apparitions, then we're putting in the category with other phenomena and people who were not religious, and people in, Buddhists and Hindus and so on. And so it's a very bad thing to talk about this evidence for life after death. Finally, I'm going to stop so other people can raise these questions.